Good evening, everyone. My name's Susanna Lamb. I'm a transplant surgeon, and I'll just talk through how I prepared for my overseas fellowship. So I sat my fellowship exam in 2017 in general surgery. I did a fellowship at RPA in 2018, followed by a fellowship in Brisbane, and then I went overseas in 2020 for about a year and a half at Leeds, and then from 2021 to the end of 2022, I was a fellow in Edinburgh, and then I came back to Sydney to start my consulting job in 2023. So essentially, my thought processes were once I got my exam, I had to consider obviously a fellowship. And at that point in time, there were various PFET and non-PFET fellowships available in Australia and overseas. So I secured a job at RPA towards the end of my Set 5, and then halfway through my first year of fellowship at RPA, I secured another fellowship in Brisbane. The whole time I was thinking about whether or not I should do an overseas fellowship, and so actively sought out options and considered advice from people who'd been overseas recently and in the past about my options. It became apparent that for me, if I wanted to do transplantation, particularly liver and kidney transplantation, that an overseas fellowship would be necessary for any future employment in a unit in Australia. So I made lots of inquiries. I contacted people in the US and also Canada. The US was difficult for me because I had not done the USMLE, although that could be, I guess, arranged on my part. I also didn't have any funding, and there were various units that I had contacts with that didn't have actual funded positions for overseas fellows. In the UK, I contacted various units. Some I contacted, and some I had other previous colleagues who'd went to, say, Cambridge or Oxford, and they helped me set up an introduction. And some of these people I contacted via phone or teleconference, and some of them I set up to meet them in person when I was visiting halfway through 2018. Most places, of course, are very positive about an application, and they'll always welcome your application. And a lot of them had suggested that I set up new NHS job alerts, particularly for ones that were well in advance. So for the first UK fellowship in Leeds, I had missed some application deadlines, and I think that was because I hadn't set up the NHS job alerts properly. There were also other positions that I had emailed early on in 2019, and they had already given their international fellowship positions away already. So early on in the 2019 Brisbane fellowship, I had a previous contact, and they reached out to someone they knew in Leeds just to see if there were any jobs available. And so I contacted the director of overseas fellowships, and they informed me that there was vacancies for the following year. And luckily for Leeds, they were used to having Australian fellows, so they understood the timeline for which we function, which is essentially a February to February year. So I was able to apply on time and got the job offer and planned for a February to March 2020 start. So once I was offered the position, then I contacted friends in the UK for information about the GMC and the visa info, which I think James will elaborate on. And then I contacted the fellows who are currently in Leeds for their advice, which is very helpful. So halfway through my second year in Leeds, so I was there from 2020 to 2021, I thought about what else I could do and what other skills I could learn whilst in the UK. I hadn't secured a consultant job in Australia yet, and Edinburgh was a good option because they have experience in this novel perfusion technology that's not in place in Australia yet, and there were only 2 units in the UK that were doing it at Cambridge and Edinburgh. And I knew people that I was currently working with who had contacts in Edinburgh, so that was really helpful. So I contacted them and then decided to move across to Edinburgh. And this was not planned initially when I left Sydney, and to be honest, I just thought I'd be in the UK for 1 year and come back to Sydney, but that obviously wasn't the case. The benefit of being in the UK is that most people know each other in a small community in transplant and HPB, and it's much easier to get your GMC and visa sorted when you're actually in the country. In terms of setting up life, I use my personal savings and finances to fund my fellowship. I had a family member living in London, which was really helpful for me. In terms of living, I found rentals when I was in Leeds, so a week before I turned up to start my job. I decided to look for rentals. So I stayed in a hotel for a couple of weeks and found something within walking distance to the hospital. Walking distance on a nice day, not on a snowy, cold day, but the area around the hospital was dodgy. When I went to Edinburgh, it was a lot harder to find a rental, mainly because things were opening up and uni students were coming back to the city, which meant that I was in an Airbnb for 4 weeks, which was quite expensive, and I think it made my situation quite desperate. I also bought a used car in April 2020, which for me was the gateway to freedom. So the things that I found most helpful was find contacts who've worked in the unit that you're interested in doing your fellowship in. And obviously, if you have bosses or colleagues who've been there, then they will be a very good introduction for you. Contact them ahead of time. I'd say 1 to 2 years is important. Set up a meeting with them, either over the phone or in person. Obviously, sign up to NHS job alerts and apply for the job on time. Also, be organised with your GMC requirements and visa application. And find a friend who's doing a fellowship in the same country or the same location and get their advice. So basically, the issues and lessons for me was that I was, I guess in hindsight, quite disorganised with ideas of fellowship, throwing around North America, Europe, United Kingdom quite late. I also contacted some units quite late, and I probably was doing everything sequentially instead of simultaneously, because basically you have to realise that you're one person vying for an international fellowship in some units that are very popular in the international field, and you're basically not the only one who's interested in working there. So unless you're organised, I think you have to just be prepared for not being offered your initial fellowship. So other issues that I would redo again if I could was probably start looking for rentals early and maybe getting someone on the ground to help if they're there. It's being prepared for high demand for uni towns if you're going there for your fellowship, particularly Edinburgh. I was priced out of a lot of rentals and I didn't understand the sort of background rental market. It's a bit difficult because you can't rent somewhere without inspecting it in the UK for legal reasons. So it's a bit of a catch-22. I'd say have a lot of spare savings and find other fellows who've been in the same boat or are doing a fellowship in the same country just for sanity and networking, debriefing. Um, and also keep your perspective on your future career goals and aspirations. Sometimes when you're overseas, you feel like you're in no man's land because you don't know where you're going. Um, you don't know what job you'll go back to, and sometimes it can feel like a bit of a slog. And it may be the case that if you have a really good time in um, the country that you're doing your fellowship in, that you may be offered a locum consultant position or a permanent position, um, which you might take up if you don't have somewhere to go back to in Australia. Some of the challenges. So obviously for me, I arrived in the UK in February of 2020, um, knowing full well that there was a Wuhan virus in China in December of 2019. Um, the plan was to start the job in Leeds in March 2020, and then there was a nationwide lockdown in March 23. Obviously, there was a lot of uncertainty with COVID, the job, lack of PPE. We were redeployed as frontline workers and didn't do as much operating as we'd liked. I lived alone in an apartment, so I was able to create a COVID bubble with some of my colleagues and um, ironically my brother who lived in London. Um, Obviously, the COVID vaccine was a turning point, and eventually elective operating increased. Uh, for me, because I wasn't in the UK with family, there was no sort of pressure for me to get back home, unlike some of my friends, and so I stayed on for a longer period after my fellows had gone back to Australia after the end of 12 months. Uh, so I think when you go overseas, you need to understand that you're a small fish in a big pond, not the other way around. And your role as a fellow is very different to what it might be in Australia. The NHS system is very different. So in Leeds, there were no junior interns. We had advanced nurse practitioners to help us. Um, and there's no real team or firm structure, which is what we're used to in Australia. Um, there are rota rostering challenges. As you can see, this photo of all my fellow registrars and fellows from Leeds during COVID. And so, you have to sort of balance work with all these people, and they're all vying for the same work, basically. You've got to understand that everyone, particularly in international units, they attract international people who have different cultural training and experiences, and so that can be difficult to navigate. And yes, big international units attract a lot of interest from good fellows. So that's just something to be aware of. There's also this thing called European Safe Working Hours, which I was quite grateful for, actually, having been flogged in my previous work in Australia. But there's also, in amongst the breaks that you have, there's also, I guess, other issues with uncertainty with your next job. From a professional perspective, I thought it was really quite valuable because of the different perspectives on healthcare. We got good volume, there's a good variety of case mix. We got exposed to different technology in organ retrieval and donation, which they just don't have or wasn't really apparent in Australia when I was a fellow. And you appreciate the Australian system a lot. You need a wide network of colleagues. There are a lot of academic and research opportunities. Not only do you learn different approaches to management and how to, I guess, deal with people, you also learn from your challenges, and that shapes your practice in the future. I've also made lifelong friends and colleagues who I happily contact when I go overseas nowadays, or if I need help or advice from them, they're literally a phone call away. From a personal perspective, I was able to connect with my UK family, um, and that was really important for me, particularly during COVID. I'm not saying that everyone will have this problem when they go overseas, but this was obviously an issue for me. Um, and I could explore the UK with my friends and the colleagues, old and new, which was the highlight for me personally. Eventually, when things open up, we can also go to Europe. Basically, I think a fellowship, of course, looks good on your CV and it can help you with employment prospects. And personally, I've maintained lots of good friendships with my fellows and with lifelong friends. Well, I think so. So just things to think about is, do you need an overseas fellowship and what are your motivations? Do you need more skills? Is your consultant job contingent on an overseas fellowship, or do you just need a life break? There are obviously opportunity costs and financial costs involved. Once you have a job or are considering a job in a unit, just know what the unit's like and speak to people who are currently in the unit for the best perspective. Obviously be flexible and adjust your expectations to the role, and there's a lot of basic ward stuff that we had to do, and there's a lot of competition for cases, but of course enjoy the days off. So thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. Thanks.